America, when you talk about race and racism, you're doing it wrong. But it's okay, because I'm here to help. I'm going to explain why it is that a lot of the vocab that we use, a lot of the terms we use when talking about race, really don't exist, and we should just stop using them because they're made up. The three main terms I want to talk about that don't really exist today are, number one, white people. They don't exist. It's made up. Number two, black Americans don't really exist. It's made up. And number three is systemic racism, which doesn't really exist. It's made up. Now, I know you're probably like, oh, no, you said no black people, no racism. Oh. Don't get out your pitchforks. Calm down. Just listen to me. I wouldn't make these big claims if I couldn't prove them with logic and with history. So let's get started by proving that white people really don't exist. I know, it just blows your mind to think about it. But consider this. A lot of people like to say that America was founded by racist white men. But did you know that at the founding of America, they didn't distinguish by the color of your skin? Instead, they distinguished by your country of origin. You see, America was not founded by white men. America was founded by Englishmen. English descent was what gained you status in this country. As an example, the English descended Americans at the start of our country did not want the Irish to be immigrating here. They looked at them as stupid, as inferior, as freeloaders. Yet today, you would probably look at an Irish person and say, oh, well, you're white, therefore you have some privilege. No, they don't. They don't have any privilege. If you are an Irish American, and part of my ancestry is Irish American, if you're an Irish American, then you descend from people that when they came to this country, they faced discrimination, they faced prejudice, and they had to work low-level manual labor jobs just like other groups in this country. You see, that's why I say that the idea of white people doesn't exist, because they don't even think of themselves as a unified collective. You have, when the Italian came over here, he faced prejudice, discrimination. You know the phrase WOP, W-O-P, without papers? It's an ethnic slur against Italian Americans. Or they would call them greasers, right? They would say they're so greasy because of, the food, the Italian food. So Italian American food, I should say. So Italians, if you're Italian American, you descend from somebody who came to this country on a boat with a few dollars in his pocket and had to lay bricks and make a life for himself, and then eventually, after a few generations, claw their way into the middle class. So this whole idea that having white skin gives you a free pass into the middle class does not exist. In fact, did you know that the descendants of a lot of those Irishmen still live in kind of substandard conditions to this day? Don't believe me? Go visit the Appalachian regions of Western Virginia, of West Virginia, of Pennsylvania, and you'll find plenty of Irish descendant people still living in less than ideal economic conditions. So this whole idea of whenever anybody with white skin just came over here, it was so easy and they just sailed to the top, that is bogus. That is absolute garbage. Irish people were not allowed the same rights and privileges as Englishmen. So if you want to talk about some form of supremacy that existed in this country, it was supremacy based on descending from Englishmen, not from just being white in general. Other groups were not considered equals to whites. That's why you have like these alt-right idiots who will say, America was founded by and for white people. Everyone else is just a servant or a foreigner. That's how they think, right? Well, I bet you a lot of those alt-right people descend themselves from Irish and from Scottish and from Italian and from other European groups who did not have a place at the table when this nation was founded. And that is why the notion of white is just bogus. It's made up. Even the European groups themselves are at variance with each other. Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't the French and English shoot at each other for 100 years? I mean, maybe I don't know my history, but the English and French regularly shot at each other. You had, during the American Revolution, you had, British soldiers shooting at their fellow English descendant people in this country. The Revolutionary War was not white on black crime. It was two European peoples shooting at each other. Or rather, it was two members of the same group shooting at each other. So this whole idea of white people is just a fiction. It's a myth. And now, because we've established that, now we can establish why black people, why black Americans is a myth. Now, here's my biggest concern with using Black American as a title. I feel like it's kind of disrespectful to people who descend from African slaves, people who wear black skin on their face, people who have African features. It's disrespectful when you basically take anybody that's not white and throw them in their group. If someone's mixed with black and white, oh, they're black. If someone has a little bit of black in them, oh, they're black. If someone, you even had bad laws on the books, like in South Carolina, where if someone was half white and half Native American, had no black in them whatsoever, if that person looked ethnically ambiguous and they couldn't tell what that person was, they would legally just mark them as black. And then Walter Plecker, which was this evil man in Virginia, he was behind something called the Racial Integrity Act, where anybody who was not white, was not fully white, was considered black on their birth certificate, even if they were full-blooded Native American, because Native Americans looked too ethnically ambiguous. And so they just wanted to lump everybody in with black people. And over time now, you could look at somebody who has lily white skin, light eyes, and soft hair, and they'll say, oh, that's a black person. Really? If you were to compare this person, I'll give examples of celebrities so you can know what I'm talking about. Alicia Keys, Congressman G.K. Butterfield. Half of the people that people celebrate in Black History Month that were really mixed with white or half white, they'll just say, oh, whatever, it's black. Now, if you did that with any other ethnic group, it would be considered disrespectful. If you took somebody who was mostly white with a tad bit of Asian and said, oh, they're Asian, would Asian people accept that? If you took somebody who was mostly Mexican and had a tad bit of white, of Irish in them, and said, oh, that person's white, would Irish Americans accept that? Maybe not. Probably not. But then why is it okay to take every single ethnic group where you don't quite know where they fit and just throw it in the black category? That basically turns the black category, instead of it being a well-defined cultural group, you just basically make it the island of misfits for races where you cannot tell what they are. Oh, you have a little bit of brown skin, I can't quite tell what you are, therefore you're black. That's really disrespectful to actual people of the African diaspora. It's disrespectful to people who look like the African diaspora, because what you're basically doing is you're hiding them under a sea of mixed race people, so where they don't get the recognition that you would expect. I'll give you an example in media. Why did they get Zoe Saldana? I don't watch movies, but I was aware that this happened. Why did they get Zoe Saldana, which is a Hispanic woman, to play Nina Simone, which was a black woman? Why did they Hispanic wash her? Could it be that a lot of people find sub-Saharan African features so repulsive? You find that black skin so hard to look at. You don't like looking at those large lips and all those kinky hair and all those features. So what do? You get someone who's diluted with European and say, okay, this is what we'll use to represent black, rather than just let African descended peoples represent themselves. So that's why I think that the term Black American is not accurate, because they'll basically take any and everybody and lump them in that category, even if they don't belong in there whatsoever. What's more is that this whole idea of Pan-Africanism or African unity doesn't really exist. Africans were shooting at each other and throwing spears at each other before the Europeans arrived. In fact, the European slave traders had a lot of help from African tribes who were already at war with each other, which, because they had whittled each other down, that's what made it so much easier for the slave masters to go and capture them and whatnot. You know, as a Native American myself, as a man of Cherokee descent, I know the history of my ancestors, and I know that my Native ancestors were fighting with each other even before the Europeans arrived, and that's just what made it easier for the Europeans to take my ancestors over. I also descend from the Native Americans in Mexico, and I know that my ancestors down there were pretty much doing the same thing. So this whole idea of just, oh, we have unity because we're the same skin color, that doesn't exist. Country A would fight country B all the time. You even had different tribes within African countries who would go to war with each other. For example, the Yoruba versus the Igbo, but they're both Nigerians. So this whole idea of people being unified based on color, be it white or black, is just a myth, folks. People represented their family, their clan, their tribe, and their country. They did not just stand for their skin color. You had people of the same skin color taking each other out, kidnapping, raping, pillaging each other all the time. That's why I feel like a more accurate phrase, to me, the phrase black is just a color. It applies to anybody that has black skin. I feel like a Sri Lankan should be considered black because their skin is black. A Polynesian with black skin could be considered black. They're not Africans, but they have black skin. Black is a color. By that logic, if you're just going by skin color, why aren't Chinese people considered white? Think about it. Most Chinese people have skin just as white as Europeans. So if white really were this biological reality that we had to look at, then why aren't Asians considered white? Especially if you consider that Europe and Asia are part of the same continent. Eurasia is its own continent. There's no landmass separating Europe from Asia. I mean, you could argue the Caucasus Mountains, but it's still the same overall continent. It sits on the same shelf. That's why it doesn't make sense to distinguish between white and Asian if you're going to talk about color in terms of white versus black. It doesn't make sense. I think a more accurate term is if somebody's partially African, partially something else, and they live in America, you know a good term you can use? An American, because all Americans are blended in some way. Just call them an American, and if someone's of African descent and is living in America, they are an American descendant of the diaspora. But to just argue that, oh, you can separate it by color, that doesn't make any sense. That's why I don't think black people exist, why I don't think white people exist. Now, let me try to very quickly explain why I don't think systemic racism exists. Now, this takes a little bit of setting up, but let me just try to boil it down to its core essence. Do you honestly believe that every single white person that existed in the Jim Crow South hated black people and followed those segregationist laws to the T? Do you honestly think everyone just, I mean, think about nowadays. Does everyone wear their seatbelt? Does everyone look both ways before they cross the street? Does everyone cross the street and when the light's green? You have people that jaywalk, people that run red lights where there's no traffic cameras, people don't wear their seatbelts today. They get past a bad law. People will say, screw that law, I'm going to do what I want to do. You honestly think that every single American just blindly obeyed those segregationist laws back then? I got good news for you. No, they didn't. They didn't. Think about it. Our character as a nation, we do not like to be controlled and forced to do something. That was what the whole American Revolution was about. So you honestly think that the descendants of the men who fought the American Revolution, all of them just said, oh, okay, well, the law says I'm not allowed to have black friends now, so I guess I'll obey and just give up my black friends and just hang out with people? No, come on now. Let's just be more realistic. I mean, not everyone follows the law today. You have exceptions today. So that's why this whole idea that every white person was racist, it's just crap, okay? It doesn't exist. Because if that were the case, you wouldn't have mixed race people existing nowadays whose ancestors were mixing during the time that mixing was illegal. People broke the law then like they break the law now. The reason why you see that segregation on the books, that was reflecting the opinions of a few political leaders, the wealthy elite who hated anybody who was poorer than them, as well as the academic elite. That's who those laws represent. Those laws did not represent the common will of the people. Just like nowadays, when you turn on the news, when you listen to a politician speak, when you listen to one of these wealthy billionaires speak, do they really represent everything that you believe and you think? Absolutely not. So don't take the segregationist words of a few and then use that to extrapolate and say that's how everybody back in those days thought. Not necessarily. Just like not everybody agrees with the law now, not everybody agreed with the law then. Now, as far as segregation was concerned, they were bad laws that were on the books. But guess what? Those laws swung both ways. Blacks were not allowed to go in the whites only section, but did y'all know that white people got arrested and got fined and got harassed by the cops for going into the blacks section. You see, the whole purpose of the law was not to establish white as superior to black. It was just to keep them separate, because guess what? If the races started mixing, they would realize that race is not a problem and start focusing on the economics of the situation. And if they did that, it would threaten the rich, wealthy elite who wanted to just step on everybody. That's the truth. The truth is they had to keep people focused on race because they didn't want them to focus on the fact that more laws were coming out that were screwing everybody over regardless of what color you were. You see, we need to unite and realize, hey, I don't care what color you are. If we're Americans, and it's the Mitch McConnells, the Nancy Pelosi's, and the Joe Bidens and the Hillary Clintons and the Bill Gateses and the George Soroses of the world. Those are the ones who are really stepping on everyone's neck. Those are the ones who make the poop sandwich that we all have to take a bite out of. And those are the ones who need to be removed from their positions of power. It has nothing to do with white versus black. That racism stuff is a distraction. It's a divide and conquer tactic, and we need to ignore it. Now, as far as but they held black people down. You had black billionaires, or African diaspora descendant billionaires, or I should say millionaires, oil barons in the Midwest before the Jim Crow South. You had prosperous towns like Rosewood. You had prosperous Native American areas like the Lumbee Indians had their own community and they still don't have federal recognition. But my very point is, you had areas of non-European descendant people who were able to succeed on their own without needing a pat on the head from the government or a sympathetic tear from a European descendant person. So those of you who think that, if you weren't European, you just couldn't do anything back then, you need to learn your history. You need to learn your history very well, study it, and don't just let people on the news influence how you think. I'll leave you with this one last thought. I have gone to school, both high school and college, with people who came straight out of Africa. I'm not talking descendants of American slaves here. I'm talking they just came from Zimbabwe. Their family didn't have two nickels to rub together. Where they lived, they didn't have air conditioning. They lived in some pretty rough conditions. Came here, the kids studied hard, paid attention in school, worked their butt off. And these are chocolate Africans, not a drop of European in them. You see, the average person that calls himself black today is probably at least 12% white. I'm talking straight up chocolate, not a single curl in their hair. It's all kink, totally dark colored skin. Now they're accountants. Now they're doctors. Now they're making big money, doing important jobs. Why? Because America's a place of opportunity. Their parents knew that, and their parents pushed them. So just like these Irish had to climb their way into the middle class, you have these recent African immigrants coming here and doing that. And if that can happen, don't tell me that the deck is stacked against so-called people of color, because it's not. We as Americans need to make the most of the opportunities that God gives us. So pray, work hard, and trust Jesus, and stop blaming other people for your problems. God bless you.